Welcome to the Ebb and Glow podcast. I'm your host, Jenelle Tremblett, and I'm a firm believer that even when life doesn't go as planned, it is taking you exactly where you're meant to be. On this podcast, I'm here to help you finally release control of what you think you want and begin to just trust in the ebbs and flows of life. Each week, I will show you how to build that positive mindset, radiate with self-confidence, and cultivate an unshakable resilience. Let me prove to you that even when life ebbs, you will glow. Hello, everyone, and welcome to, you guessed it, episode 100 of the Ebb and Glow podcast. I'm your host, Jenelle, and today's episode is a huge milestone of the podcast that I am incredibly proud of. I've accomplished a lot in my life throughout high school and university and in my 20s and all the moving I did and whatnot, but there's just something about this milestone that I am so proud of. And I think back to all the work that has gone into this milestone and this accomplishment. And yeah, I think the most important part is how proud I am of myself and how long and how fun and how enjoyable this journey has become so far and has been so far. And I'm excited to use this episode to go through a time lapse of the past 2 years. Yeah, 2 years, which is insane to me. And kind of go through the ups and downs, just like the brand and mission of this podcast, because it has definitely not been smooth sailing. But overall, when I think about all the moments over the past 2 years, it has been an incredibly rewarding journey so far. So I'm happy to have you here. And if whether or not you are a podcaster or not, if you are a podcaster, I hope this episode encourages you to keep going. Or if you're not a podcaster, I hope this episode encourages you to finally start that thing that you've been dreaming of for so long and you keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, because as you will learn in this episode, and as I've come to realize, the time is going to pass regardless. If you've been dreaming about anything in your life and wanted to get started, I think the biggest thing you should be asking yourself is, what are you waiting for? Because as I just said, the time is going to pass regardless. So I want to take this episode to just reminisce a little bit about the last 2 years. Hopefully, if you ever want to start a podcast, maybe you get some tips and tricks and take some lessons from the stuff that I've done well and have not done well. But let's use today's episode as just a memorable journey to go down and a way for me to just reminisce over everything in the past 2 years. I've talked about this a few times in previous episodes, and the reason why I started the podcast was, as I just spoke about and as I'm giving advice on, it's something that I dreamt about probably since 2015, 2016, and think I didn't actually start my podcast until October of 2020. So it's something I thought about for 4-5 years continuously. I was a long-time podcast listener. I listened to podcasts all day long, and I was watching so many podcasts just grow and the conversations they were having. And it seemed to me that it was just such a rewarding passion to be part of. And I dreamt about it for so long. Me and one of my girlfriends talked about starting a podcast for a while, and that never came to fruition, but it was still this voice in the back of my head that said, hey, Jenelle, I think you would be really good at this. I think you have a passion and a gift for this type of work. And what are you waiting for? Let's just get started. And it's always one of those things when you're thinking about something for so long, it almost seems like the universe conspires for you. Because I remember, I think I was scrolling through LinkedIn. This is probably the spring or summer of 2020. And I'm scrolling through LinkedIn. And it's funny, I don't really ever follow people on LinkedIn, but I guess I did follow this person a while back. And so basically a podcaster that I've been listening to her podcast for 5 years. It was a financial podcast, like a financial money podcast. And she made this post on LinkedIn. I didn't even realize I was following her on LinkedIn, which is so random and weird. It's like almost like following like a celebrity on Instagram, because she is, in my eyes, like a little bit of a celebrity. Anyways, I was following her and I saw her make a post about that her and another podcaster were launching this program, basically teaching people how to launch a podcast. And like I said, it's almost like the universe was conspiring for me because I've been dreaming about starting a podcast for so long. And here I am scrolling through LinkedIn, and there's my one-way ticket to go figure out how to launch a podcast and do it correctly. Mind you, it was a bit of a monetary investment. It was probably one of the biggest monetary investments that I made in my life. Sure, I did university and whatnot, but there are very few times in my life that I invested that amount of money to start something that I didn't even know if anything was going to come out of it. And if I remember correctly, it was about either $1,000 or $1,500 Canadian that I paid for that course. And it was an 8-week accelerator program that every week they would teach you, like, let's figure out what you want a podcast about. Let's figure out what's the frequency, what's the branding going to look like? How are you going to promote it? And every week there was different modules on how to get started so that by the end of the 8-week program, you would have a podcast ready to launch with episodes recorded. And I'm the type of person that, yes, I'm very accountable to myself once I know how to do something. But if I can go through like an 8-week program and stay consistent with learning and whatnot, I knew that I would have a podcast by the end of it. But it's funny when I look back and I think back. So that was a little over 2 years ago that I was in this course. Yeah, like this time 2 years ago, I was still doing the course because I didn't launch until mid-October. I remember feeling like I was falling behind in that program. I was watching people already have their ideas figured out, getting guests launched, getting guests booked, and creating lots of episodes. And I remember doing the coursework and feeling like I was falling behind because I couldn't land that idea of what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to launch a podcast, but I still had no idea what I wanted to talk about. And I remember, it's funny thinking back now, halfway through the course, I was going down a direction of a completely different podcast idea. If I remember correctly, I would have to go back throughout my journals and see what I was writing. But I remember, I think I was going with like a marketing and sales podcast at one point. Yeah, I think I was 4 weeks into the course and I was designing my entire program and podcast around this idea of like sales and marketing or like careers or something. I think it was sales and marketing, like pivoting or career pivots. I don't remember. It was nothing like I'm doing now. And I remember feeling very stagnant within the course and launching the idea. The idea that I was going with didn't feel right to me. And I kept going through the course and not being excited to like continue and not even being excited to launch this brand and the podcast. And I had to sit back at one point. I remember this day very clearly. I sat back and I said to myself, this idea is not it. Let's go right back to the drawing board. Let's start day one of this coursework again and come up with a whole new idea. And so what I did, I remember sitting on my rooftop of my building very vividly. I can remember this and just journaling, being like, okay, let's start writing down all the words that come to mind when I think about this podcast. How do I want to feel? How do I want the guest to feel? What words and phrases do I want to be aligned in this podcast? Then I started opening up a Pinterest board. Let's visualize the imagery of what I wanted this to look like. And I kept pinning stuff about waves and sea turtles and beaches. And there was a lot of like light blues and light pinks, which, as you guys know, you listen to this podcast, you can start seeing it come to light. And I'm realizing like, okay, once I sit back and actually allow myself to dream about this podcast, it has nothing to do with sales and marketing. It's not corporate. It's not businessy at all, which I was shocked. I was like, oh, it's more about people's stories and chatting to them and vulnerability and openness. And I really wish I had that journal with me right now. I almost want to see if I can find it and like come up with words. Oh yeah, there it is. Anyone who's watching this on YouTube is watching me find the journal in my desk right now. Okay, let's pull it out. I'm going to tell you exactly what I was journaling about. Okay, let's find this right now. Okay, I found the journal. This is so funny. I wish I read this before I started recording this podcast, but it's almost funnier in real time. Okay, I just found my old journals of me when I was going through this course that I'm speaking of, and I'm brainstorming and writing notes about what I want the podcast to be. Oh my God, this is so reminiscent right now. Okay, let's read some of my notes. It just says project podcast brainstorming. So my initial thoughts back then, I was putting notes down of like navigating your personal brand. I said, I want listeners to feel like it's almost like Dear Sugar style, like coming for advice, pivot stories, pick yourself back up stories. What was your rock bottom? Okay. So at this point, I was onto something. I have some ideas around debating topics. Let's understand it from two different opinions. I was playing around with podcast names. I had one name that I was thinking about called Below the Surface. And in quotes, I have I'll figure it out and let's stir things up. So yeah. Oh, and then I had another idea of let's make it around like all kinds of questions like, okay, how do I do this? How do I do that? Yeah, I was going everywhere. I have some more points about on the brink of fears or diving in head first. Okay, so I guess that's where my water theme eventually comes in. Okay, as I'm digging more throughout this journal, this is precisely why I like journaling because you can go back and read what you were writing before and you can really bring yourself back to that point. Okay, I remember doing this other little like exercise in your why, like why are you starting a podcast and how to have like a clear mission of why and like your podcast from the beginning and how important that was. So I want to read out what I was writing at that point. And I remember at this point, I was getting a lot more clear about what I wanted the podcast about. I was getting a little bit more clear and I was starting to get into that more brand of like the ebb and glow. I'm going to read this out. This is vulnerable. I have never read this again since the day I wrote it. So let's see what I wrote. So the question was throughout this exercise, like, what is your why? Why are you starting this podcast? And I wrote down, I want to start a podcast because I know how to ask the deep personal questions, but in an empathetic way. I listen to podcasts every single day, all day, and can't help but think, why am I not doing that? I was meant for it. I want a podcast that shows life is tough, but there's proof you will bounce back from it. I enjoy podcasting because I love chatting to people and really learning their struggles, but more importantly, how they overcame them. I want to take deep personal topics and make them a little lighter. I want to show that everyone has problems, big and small, dark, but also laughable. I want to add humor, emotion, light, humanness to everyone and make them realize they're not in it alone. Wow. Wow, that's really powerful. And think this is based on the dates of this journal. This is looking like July or August of 2020. Yeah. I hope that gives you inspiration of why you should journal and why you should just sit down and get quiet and really start writing out exactly what you want and why you want it and what you're dreaming of. Because it's funny reading that back, think we're 2 years past this now. And that's exactly how I still feel about this podcast. And that is still my why. 100%. Wow. This is, you're hearing this in real time right now. Like I did not have this planned. I just found this journal while I'm sitting at this desk recording this, but yeah. Oh my God, that makes me so happy. Okay. I know there's another page in this journal. Okay, here we go. And for anyone that's watching this on YouTube, I'm going to show you what this page looked like that helped me brainstorm this podcast. So look at this photo. So this is kind of like the dream board of like all the feelings that I wanted for the podcast to have. And I wrote them in all different like fonts and colors. So I'll read some of the words out that allowed me to really start brainstorming and creating the brand that you now know as Ebb and Glow. So I have down release negative energy, overcoming your inner critic, self-love, magnetic, communication, inspire, soul energy, confidence, shine, abundance, authentic, internal voice. I radiate confidence and positivity, grounded, humanness, self-worth, mindset, vibes, guidance, trust the process. What's your purpose? Honesty, express yourself, empathy. Yeah. Oh, it's so powerful that I'm going back and listening to all of this right now. I've completely lost the agenda per se of what I was going to talk about in this episode, but I'm kind of liking where it's going anyways. But I want to pivot a little bit. I want to kind of talk about some of the things I've learned, some of the surprises I've had, some of the pivotal changes that have happened throughout the past 2 years of when I've made changes throughout the podcast and why, things I wish I've done better, and kind of like what I see going into year 3 of the podcast. So obviously, we just talked about how I got started and why, and really deeply, vulnerably why. Clearly, I just read out actually a journal entry. That's so funny. I need to start taking my own advice and being vulnerable when I'm telling people to be vulnerable. So here you have it. But some of the things I learned and taught myself throughout building this podcast is I taught myself how to build a website. I taught myself how to build email campaigns, learning how to create content, learning how to promote. And mind you, like, this podcast is definitely a hobby. Like, it's definitely a passion project that I've been building over the past 2 years. It's not a monetizing type podcast at all. It's definitely more of a hobby and a creative project and pursuit. And that means I've spent money. I've spent not a lot of money, but I've spent money on building websites. I pay monthly fees for hosting and for Squarespace and for the platforms that I edit on. And I pay for Canva and all these other things monthly that I use to build and promote the podcast. And then not to mention the time I spend in the podcast every single week, creating the episodes, interviewing the guest, researching the guest, editing and promoting and making content to promote it. There's a lot of time and energy that goes into it. And I don't know if that's clear from your view of things, but just know that anything that is well put together, there's so much time and energy behind the scenes of someone building this day in, day out. And there's so many nights and weekends, and anyone that's super close to me or anyone I've dated in the past couple of years, they know how much time and energy goes into this podcast. And I've had to say no to being with the people I love a lot of the time because I'm building this and I need to edit it, and I stick to a schedule and I take it very seriously. So it's not just money that you spend when you're building something, it's the time and it's the opportunity cost that you lose that you could be using that time elsewhere. But knowing that you have a bigger mission in mind, it allows yourself to be fueled and want to grow something, and you don't feel like you're missing other opportunities of time that you could spend elsewhere. Other places I've spent money on this podcast so far, I've hired graphic designers to help with the podcast cover art. I actually have version 3 of the cover art coming out very soon. So I've went to my previous graphic designer. I'm getting her to redo the logo a little bit. And then I'm getting new photos done so I can have them as part of the podcast cover art. I also hired a podcast editor back in February that helps me in terms of editing the podcast and saves me a lot of time that way. So there's definitely, again, time and money that go into building anything worthwhile. And anyone who's listening to this that has built something or created something or has taken a risk at something knows how much time and money and energy goes into that. Yeah, when I think back, there's so many late nights that have been put into this podcast, but it's so enjoyable. I know for me, some of the most surprising things that have come up for me is realizing how creative I really am. I am not a graphic designer by trade. I am a marketer. I did do a marketing degree. I did work in the marketing profession for a while before real estate, but I'm not a graphic designer. And it's nice. I've taught myself how to use Canva and taught myself how to use a lot of different programs to be able to do video editing and create graphics and stuff. And mind you, if I hired an actual video editor or hired a graphic designer to do all these things, of course they would be better. But I remember as I was creating them, I'm like, oh, these are pretty good. Like, I like them. I think they look good. I think they're eye-catching. And I've had other graphic designers tell me that, oh, your website is really good. Like, your graphics and social media content are really good. Like, who do you hire to do it? And I said, I do it. And so it was nice getting a compliment from someone who like has an eye for those things. So definitely was surprised by how creative I am and how my creativity came out through this podcast a lot. I was also surprised by, as I was mentioning earlier, that when you love something so much, you don't think about the time that you're spending on it anymore. So there's been many, many, many nights at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night that I'm working on this podcast. And I'm so full of energy and buzzed up by the energy and the excitement that I'm not tired. I'm not just doing it to get it done. I'm excited by it. I'm excited to build it. And anyone that's listening that's maybe a founder or entrepreneur or has cared about anything in your life, you know that you don't even notice the time when you love what you're doing. I want to chat about some of the top moments so far in this podcast. Normally, I should tell you about the ebbs and then the glows, but I really want to chat about the glows. I remember, again, very vividly, one time. So every morning, I just have this obsession of I check the download numbers. I see kind of who listened to the podcast. Not who, but how many people listened to the podcast the day before. And for a while, like mind you, I've been doing this for 2 years now. So it is like kind of a steady amount of numbers every single time. There's a number that I'm kind of expecting. Like on Wednesdays, when I launch the podcast on Tuesdays, on Wednesdays, I'm kind of expecting a bit of a bigger spike. But I remember this one time I logged in. It was after I did, I guess that I was very surprised about and how well it went. But I logged in that morning to check the download numbers, and I thought there was a glitch in the platform that I use for hosting. I was like, no way that number can be correct. Like, no way. It was an insane amount of download numbers. And I was shocked. Like I said, I genuinely thought something was broken. I remember hitting refresh like 10, 15, 20 times. I mean, and like logging out and logging back in. I was like, no way that this is real at all. Anyways, it was real, but it just makes me so happy and in awe. And I'll never forget that moment of when I realized, oh, wow, this episode is crazy performing and people are loving it. And wow, like I'm building something here. And yeah, it was such a phenomenal feeling. And it was almost like one of those feelings of I've made it, or I've built something here, or something's working. And yeah, it's a really, really great feeling if you've ever felt something any bit similar to that. But yeah, it made me so happy. So this was like a year ago. And I've had a couple more moments like that where an episode really took off and I woke up the next morning and be like, whoa, what's happening here? But now I know it's not broken. I just know it's a really good episode. And it always makes me so happy because I truly believe the conversations we're having on this podcast are powerful. They're vulnerable. They're open. They're everyday people talking about the same types of things that you are going through. And the best way to know that you're not alone in something is to hear someone else talk about a very similar situation that they've been through. Some other milestones that I've had and changes and pivots and whatnot. Throughout this past 6 or 7 months of the podcast, I've interviewed a lot more of my friends. So people who know me and listen to the podcast would obviously recognize some of my friends and names. And I find that added a new level to the podcast for me. It felt more intimate. It felt more natural to start interviewing my friends. And I found that my inner circle, my inner network was really excited for those episodes because they know these people, they want to hear what they have to say. And those are some of the most downloaded episodes of the podcast so far. And I find it's been really fun interviewing my friends and whatnot. And I've had some acquaintances reach out recently asking to be on the podcast and people I never expected to ever want to be on. And so it just makes my heart warm knowing that, oh, wow, I would never think you were someone that was going to be open and vulnerable. And the fact that you are reaching out to me and wanting to be on this, that's so cool. And I know that if I see them that way, maybe other people see them that way. And I think it's going to be really powerful to hear them on in future episodes, which I'm really excited about. Another change I made in the podcast this year was I started doing a lot more solo episodes, and I've found those to be extremely empowering and extremely pivotal for my growth and my journey. And it's a reminder to you that I'm not just the host. Like I'm going through stuff the same way you are going through. And in the past like 5 or 6 months or whenever I started that, and made it a little bit more of a priority to do a monthly solo episode. And it's almost like a audio diary for myself where I'm sure if I go back and listen to episodes in January, February, March, I'm a very different person than I was back then. And hearing through the changes that I was going through and the ups and downs, I'm sure would be interesting for me to go back and listen to. And yeah, it's nice to kind of have that verbal diary to be able to share with others, as well as, again, a reminder to say, hey, my life might look great on Instagram or on social media or whatever, but hey, there's stuff that's happening in my life too, big and small, ups and downs, wins and losses. And it's important that people know that and add that level of vulnerability and realness to this podcast, because I'm always expecting everyone else to open up. And if I'm not doing that, that's, in my opinion, pretty hypocritical. I remember the first time I did a solo episode, it was so weird, like so strange. It was so weird, like sitting in my house and just kind of like talking into the abyss. I felt so awkward. Like I felt like a weirdo. And if anyone's ever like done content creation before, like even taking a selfie or taking a video of yourself in public, like you feel like, yeah, you just feel weird. Like you just feel like you're not supposed to be doing that, or like you shouldn't, like it just feels not natural. And it's funny, recording this episode right now, this is many, many, many solo episodes after. It feels so natural to just like talk in my house and talk to a microphone and even like talk to like my Zoom recording on screen. And it's really interesting for me to look back at just like the growth and the confidence and how natural it's become. And it just goes to show that you're not going to be an expert at your craft right away. I'm not an expert on real estate yet, but I'm a lot better than I was 2 years ago. I am not an expert podcast host yet, but damn, have I ever improved in 2 years. Even now, like, yeah. So when I first recorded my first solo episode just on audio, so weird. I re-recorded it so many times. I was so nervous to just like speak. It was so weird. It was not natural. It was just strange. And then I went through the part where I started recording my solo episodes on video as well. And that's only recent. And if you look back at some of the first solo episodes via video, I'm like not even looking at the camera. Like my side is turned. I'm like looking out the window. But now I've gotten much more comfortable, like watching myself on the camera, looking at the camera a bit more, knowing how to hold the microphone and being more comfortable. So I'm watching the journey myself of my comfortability and my naturalness get better as more go on. And I want to bring this back to a main point that do not wait until you are the best at something to start. People find it so much more enjoyable to watch the journey. They don't need it to be perfect from the beginning. They love joining you on that journey and watching you grow and watching you build. It's a great reminder to everyone else to just start, you know? One of the biggest quotes I've heard that really, really put things in perspective when I was starting the podcast is, if you are not embarrassed by your first couple episodes or first launch or first like cover art, or to make this a little bit more generic, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of something that you put out, then you did not start fast enough. You did not launch quick enough. And trust me, I hate the first version of my cover art. It was fantastic when I had it and I needed it to launch. But I look back now and I'm like, oh, that's so bad. I want to get rid of like every bit of social media post that has that cover art. Ugh, it's awful in my opinion. But I have version 3 of the cover art coming out very shortly, probably in the next couple of weeks, that I'm really excited about. I feel like it looks really clean. And I'm embarrassed by version 1, and I'm happy to be embarrassed by version 1. Like, I do not want to even go back and listen to some of my first episodes. I'm sure they're awful. The editing is so bad. Like, oh my God. But no one's expecting the first thing you launch to be the level that it is at 2 years from now. So no one was expecting episode 1 of mine to be as good as episode 100. And when I get to episode 200, I'm going to listen back to this episode and think, oh God, that was awful. What was I thinking? But it's kind of refreshing to be a little bit embarrassed by your first bit of projects and having that embarrassment and having that, being able to like laugh at yourself and realizing that when you look back, oh wow, I've grown so much. I've perfected my craft a lot more. I've gotten a lot better. I've succeeded more. I've grown. And as you're listening to this, I want you to reminisce and think back to What's something you've been doing for the past couple of years and building towards that? When you look back at square one, where you started, I'm sure it's so different. And I'm sure you're in awe of how far you've come. And take a moment to think about that. Think about when you first started your job. I'm sure you're a lot better at that job now. I'm sure you were so nervous when you first started. I'm sure you remember the first outfit that you wore during the interview. And now you're probably running the show in this career years and years later. And you think back to the person you were when you first started. Those are different people. Same, but a new version of them. And I think that's something to be really proud of, no matter what that example is for you. When I think back to the success that I've had building this podcast over the past couple of years, it's not success that came out of nowhere. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, there is a lot of work that goes into this. And I want to highlight some of the reasons I feel that this podcast has grown so much. One of the reasons I feel is that I was really focused on how the brand looked before I launched. I was really particular about having a brand and a mission and a cohesive look that people could link themselves to and relate to and get used to. So if you look through any of my social media content, all the colors are same. I was very specific about the podcast title, the mission, how the website looked, how all the content looked, even every single thing from my emails that go out to guests and the process of signing up to be a guest. Everything is very cohesive and it looks like a well-built company. And because I think if you're treating something like just a side hobby, it's going to come across as a side hobby and people aren't going to take it seriously enough. But for me, when I am choosing guests to have on the podcast, I have a discovery call before I would ever hit record with them. And the reason for that is it's almost like a first date. It's almost like a coffee date before we actually go on the date, just as like a little introduction. And it allows us to set the tone for what the feeling of the episode is going to be like, allow them to get to know me and me to get to know them, align on the topics that we want to talk about. And I find by doing that, it sets everyone up for success. They know what they're getting themselves into and they understand the process and the intention behind everything. Another thing that I feel is part of the success is I do a lot of research on my guests and I do a lot of prepping prior to the episode. There's been so many guests that I've read their entire book prior to recording with them. And it's funny, there's some guests I've read their entire book and we never ended up recording, just like scheduling conflicts. And then they kind of ghosted me. And I have no regrets about reading their books. Their books were still great, but for me, it was a little disheartening knowing how much time and effort I put into it. And we never even ended up recording. And it's like, I read your whole book, but you didn't even want to come on for 45 minutes to even promote the book. Whatever. And I buy all their books and everything. Like no one sends me anything for free. Like I buy them and purchase them. But yeah, there's 2 or 3 guests where I read their entire book and they never ever came on. I'm thinking about that. That's really annoying. Whatever. It's all in the past. They were great books regardless. But it's just a reminder that prep regardless, because I was so prepared for them to come on. And if they ever do want to come on in the future, I already have all those notes and questions ready. And it was even good practice to know how to prepare for other guests. And maybe if I interviewed someone else around the similar topics, I already kind of know a lot about that topic that I'm curious about that I want to ask them about. But I think you get the feeling that I take it seriously. I do the research. I know what I want to talk about. It's not just like an off the cuff interview by any means. Like I'm ready for it. But in saying that, I find being a good host and a good interviewer, you have to be able to have a lot of flow in the conversation. Because if you have 10 questions that you want to ask, but then the conversation is going in a different direction, knowing how to still be curious about what's happening and being present in the moment while you're interviewing them, instead of kind of waiting until you get to the next question. And you can feel that if you listen to other podcasts and it feels like a little bit more interview style where it's like question, answer. It just has no flow. So it definitely takes a lot of skills and it's a gift to be able to kind of just flow with the conversation and just be naturally curious. One thing that I've found myself getting better at is being so concentrated and connected and engaged with that guest and the conversation as if I just met them at a party. I'm always kind of trying to change my mindset of like, okay, I met this person at a party. We're having drinks. What would I naturally ask them right now? Because let's think, I've never met them before. What would I genuinely ask them after they said that? And that has allowed me to make the conversations feel very flowy. And there's some guests that I've had where I have a ton of questions ready, didn't even get to any of them because the conversation took a very different path. And I think that's a little bit of life advice. The influencer that a lot of people know, her name is Tinks. She says this one thing, and it might be a phrase from someone else, but it's definitely a mantra that I like to bring into my life and remind myself of is when you make plans, God laughs. What that means is you can have everything planned out, but the universe always has something else planned for you. So it's just kind of a reminder to go with the flow and stop kind of pre-planning everything and stop being so rigid in your everyday life. Especially if I was rigid in these conversations that I have with these guests, it would not be as flowy and conversational and interesting as I feel they are when I'm just naturally engaged and curious. When I think back over the past 2 years and 100 episodes in the books, couple things that I really wish I did better and that I will be focusing on in going into year 3 is one of the biggest things I wish I did better is kind of being a little bit more intentional and purposeful when I'm asking my guests to promote the episode. I've kind of left it up to them and I mean, it's a podcast about them. I would assume that they'd want to promote it, but there's definitely some guests that I didn't see them share the episode at all. And it's a little disheartening after you put in so much work, and time and effort. It's free to everyone. It's like free promotion for the guest about whatever they're promoting. And watching them never send around the episode at all, it can hurt for sure. So one thing that I want to ensure going into year 3 is kind of following up with guests and seeing if they've promoted the episode at all. Or, I mean, I've had guests throughout the past 2 years that I don't even think they listened back to the episode. That's so strange to me, in my opinion. Whenever I've been on a podcast, I'm so excited to listen to the episode and promote it. So I don't know where the disconnect is there or the difference, but yeah, I always found that weird. But you can definitely tell through the download numbers which guests have promoted their episodes and which haven't. And I mean, it's a two-way street, right? We're a team of promoting this episode and promoting this message. So I would just want to be a little bit more, I don't want to say pushy, but I want to have a bit of a higher expectation when asking guests to promote their episode. And that'll inevitably lead to better download numbers and better attraction and better awareness of the podcast. And that part that I wish I did better at is also a 2-part where I really, going into year 3, I want to build up the email list a little bit more and the listenership. A lot of my listeners, I feel, are my immediate network and the networks of the guests I have. Now, based on the download numbers, I'm definitely finding there's new audiences finding me because there's people are almost like binge listening the podcast a bit and like listening to like 5 to 6 episodes in a row. However, I want to expand the podcast and expand the growth a lot more to be able to bring in new listeners that I know are looking for this type of content and that will gain a lot of value from it. So that's going to be the big question mark and part of the podcast that is going to be top of mind for me going to year 3 is how to build this into something bigger. And some of the other dreams I have in year 3 is I just want to make it more clear the mission of this podcast. And I don't know if I want to go in this direction, but I've been thinking about it of maybe doing merch and not really merch with like my podcast logo or anything on it, but like phrases and whatnot that represent the brand. And I feel that people would resonate with, whether it's like merch in terms of clothing or just like iPhone backgrounds. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I want to have a little bit more than just the episode. Other things I want to do, another milestone I'm about to hit is I'm so close to 10,000 downloads. So if you're listening to this episode, please share it around so that we can finally hit that 10K download mark. I'm so excited. I knew it would be close to the 100 episode mark. So I think there's about maybe 3 more episodes to go that will hit that 10K download mark pretty easily. The other thing I want to do is I want to bring on bigger guests. I want to bring on names that people recognize and that are searching for. A lot of the guests I've had are everyday people. And while I love that, I definitely want to bring on some more guests with a little bit of bigger audience to be able to expand that reach. I need to be able to marry those two together because that inevitably is going to help grow the podcast. And the other thing I want to do with this podcast is I want to be intentional and mindful of what is the purpose of all of it? Why am I doing this? Because as I've said a bunch of times within this episode, it is a lot of work. It's a lot of sweat equity gets put into this podcast. And I know deep down, one of the biggest dreams that I have for myself is to have a talk show. Think like Oprah or Ellen or Kelly Clarkson. I love the Kelly Clarkson show. And I have no idea how doing this and doing that. I don't know how to build that bridge in between, but I hope to build it someday. And I hope 10 years from now that when I have my own talk show host or whatever version of that is at that point, I can go back and look at this clip and just laugh and being like, I wanted that 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And I made it happen. I manifested it. I built it. I worked for it. So, I mean, we have this proof that I've been wanting this for so long. So I hope it transpires. So yeah, those are kind of the dreams that I have with this. And it's going to take some time, but yeah, I want to be clear within the next year of the podcast where this is going, because if I don't have something to work towards or a reason to do this, you start questioning yourself every week of asking, why am I doing this? Why am I putting these hours in? What is this all for? And I don't want to get to that point of being like, whatever, who cares if this episode goes out? Because I've been so consistent over the past 2 years that I want to keep that accountability and keep growing that. So I need some bigger dreams and I need to start manifesting on those and get them transpiring. I think that's that word, in order for me to continue to have gas in me to be able to keep growing this and keep the energy going, alive and well. But yeah, that's what I think about that. Anyways, I want to start concluding this episode, and I want to conclude it with just the utmost appreciation and gratitude for every single person who is listening to this today, or who has ever listened to an episode or liked any of my posts or shared anything around. Just know it means a lot. When anyone is growing anything in terms of a business or a project, any bit of sharing and telling people and word of mouth is so helpful and appreciated to them. So just know that I know who you are. I know who is sharing and listening and being part of this journey with me. And just know I notice and I'm not going to forget it. And I mean that with the most appreciation that I possibly can. The past 2 years has been so fun building this podcast. There's been so many fantastic conversations and deep, deep conversations that have happened on this podcast. And just watching myself grow into the person of someone who can build something from the ground up and seeing what it has become in 2 years and knowing what it can and will become in years to come. As I said from the beginning, I'm very proud, extremely proud of myself. And I hope that there's something in your life that you're proud of as well, because this feeling is, I hope, contagious. And this feeling is worth having. After all the work that gets put into it, it's a feeling that's really worth it. Like I said, I want to conclude this episode by leaving you with a little bit of encouragement and advice. I want you to really start thinking about that voice in the back of your head that's saying, hey, you're meant for more. Why are you only doing this when you know you're meant for this? What's stopping you? You know you're good at this, but yet you're not taking that first step to get started. Really identify the roadblocks and the made up excuses of why you're not getting started. Because I know the only roadblock in your way is you. And a lot of the times we procrastinate as a mask of self-sabotaging, and you've got to start questioning yourself about why you're doing that. And stop spending so much time watching everyone else do what they're doing. Put your phone down, put your phone away, and really think,
if you start dedicating 1, 2 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years to something that you genuinely want in your life, you would be shocked at what you could have a year from now, 2 years from now, 6 months from now, even. I'm telling you, the biggest realization that I've had this week is that the time is going to pass regardless. I launched this podcast October 12th, 2020, after 4 to 5 years of dreaming about it. And my only regret, as most people always say, my only regret is not starting sooner. I think about where this could be if I started 2 years earlier, 4 years earlier. But I mean, I can't regret any of that stuff. All I can think is and be proud and in awe of everything that I've built in the past 2 years. But like I said, the regret I have is not starting sooner. So I'm going to repeat myself one more time. I want you to think about what's that thing that you've been procrastinating on, something that you really, really want to do and accomplish in life or build or start. And please just start. What's the worst that's going to happen? The worst thing that's going to happen is it's another 6 months to a year from now, and you still haven't gotten started. The time is going to pass regardless. So I want you to take today's episode and take the encouragement and inspiration, and please just begin, because I've said this on previous episodes. If you have gifts that you're not sharing with the world, it's very selfish. And that's a big disservice to both you and both us. And get clear on what you are brought into this earth to do and the natural gifts you have. And just please start sharing them with the world. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. I hope you loved it. Let's give a big cheers to 100 episodes of the Ebb and Glow podcast. I couldn't have done it without all of you listening to this each week. And just know that I have the utmost gratitude for everyone who has taken the time and spent their time and energy with me on this podcast. So thank you again. I hope you love it. And I can't wait to have you back here again next week. Okay, bye. Did you know that I'm not only a podcast host, but in my full-time career, I am a Toronto-based real estate agent. In 2021, I closed 100 deals. Yes, you heard that correctly, 100. So if you or someone you know is a busy professional looking to get into the Toronto real estate market and looking to work with a realtor who values your time, make sure to reach out to me and let's get connected. And in the meantime, we'll see you here back next week.